Welcome to this course on abnormal psychology. My name is Mike Raulin, and I'll be the instructor for the course. I've annotated these slides with my boys so that you can effectively experience the lectures without literally being in class. In this first chapter, we're going to look at the definition of abnormal. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we study abnormal psychology. In each chapter, we're going to start with a slide that gives the learning objectives for the chapter. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about how we define abnormal psychology and make the diagnoses. And we're going to discuss some concepts that are associated with studying psychopathology. The diagnostic manual is called the DSM. The current version is DSM-5. And it lists all of the disorders that we recognize along with their diagnostic criteria, that is how we make the diagnosis, and information that we know from research about the various disorders. We classify the disorders into broad categories, and each of the chapters of the book generally represents one or two of these broad categories. We cannot study abnormal psychology without first addressing the question of what do we mean by abnormal. All of us tend to have a sense of what's normal or abnormal, but our sense may not be shared by everyone. At one level, people that are abnormal behave differently than what the culture expects of them. But as you'll see, there are other criteria that we use to define abnormality as well. Culture is probably the most important thing in terms of defining abnormality. If we behave differently than what people expect us to do, we are often viewed as inappropriate. And it's amazing how distressing it is for people to be around others who are behaving in this inappropriate way. They find it disturbing or puzzling and sometimes downright scary. It's also important to realize, though, that cultures vary, and what's considered normal in one culture might be considered abnormal in another culture. And what's considered abnormal in one culture may not only be considered normal, but may be considered desirable in another culture. A second criteria for abnormality is subjective distress. How much are you hurting? If you're really anxious, for example, that's a terribly uncomfortable situation. If you're very depressed, that's a very uncomfortable situation. You want the anxiety or the depression to go away. Those symptoms are said to be ego-dystonic. Ego-dystonic means you don't like them. You want them to be cured. You want them to go away. We can define abnormality on the basis of the distress that the person feels. So someone can be very anxious. Now they may perform well and they may look culturally perfectly reasonable. But because they are so distressed, we consider it to be abnormal based on the distress that they experience. We also define abnormality in terms of disability. If you're very anxious, for example, you may not be able to do certain things because the anxiety is too high to allow yourself to function. And that's a disability. You're not able to perform the things that are expected of you. Be aware that disability is defined within an individual. So it's possible, for example, that someone may be exceptionally talented and functioning at a very high level, but they become depressed and their performance drops dramatically. But their performance is still better than many other people, even though it's well below their personal norm. Does that mean they don't have a disability? No, they do have a disability, because without the depression, their performance level would be much higher. I want to introduce a concept here that's going to be very important. The concept is taxonomy versus continua. A taxonomy is a difference in kind, so men and women are taxonomic categories. A male has an X and a Y chromosome, a female has two X chromosomes. Things like intelligence and height tend to be on continua. In continua, most of the people are in the middle range, and as you move away from the middle range, the frequency of individuals drops fairly dramatically. So most people, for example, are probably between, say, 5'2" and 5'8". But there are a few people that are 7 feet tall, and there are a few people that are 4 feet tall. But there aren't a lot of people that are well outside that narrow range where most people fall. This is important because in psychiatry, and it's the American Psychiatric Association that publishes the Diagnostic Manual, psychiatry is a medical discipline. And as you'll see, medical disciplines expect taxonomies. That may not always be true. Sometimes people like statistical definitions for disorders where you clearly do have a continuum. For example, intellectual functioning, IQ, shows a normal curve with most people in the range of, say, 70 to 130, with the mean of 100. About 95% of the people are between those ranges. So if we use the objective criteria being statistically unusual, then we don't have to make any subjective judgments. But the truth is, we don't actually do that. We do have diagnostic criteria for people who have IQs below 70 and have other deficits as well. We call them intellectually disabled. We used to call them mentally retarded. But we don't have a sense that the other end of that distribution, which is statistically as unusual as the lower end of the distribution, is abnormal. Einstein was really abnormal in the sense that he was statistically unusual. Very few people were ever as bright as Einstein. But we don't call him abnormal, we call him a genius. So even though statistical definitions can and are used in some of the definitions of abnormality, we still make personal judgments about whether particular traits are desirable or not. I mentioned a moment ago that the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, who has published it right from the beginning. Now, psychologists contribute extensively to the DSM and have since about 1980 or so. But it is still biased in the sense that most of the disorders are assumed to be taxonic. That is, to be taxonomies, differences in kind. So someone who has major depression is different from someone, not just in degree, who gets depressed occasionally, but different in kind. Now that may be true, or it may not. But the assumption within our diagnostic manual is that it's usually true. There are many people that doubt that, and we will talk about that as we're going through the course for various disorders. I want to address one other issue that is often overlooked, but is very important. We think of the opposite of abnormality as being normality. We talk about mental health, but often we confuse mental health with something else. Mentally healthy people get anxious just like everyone. They get depressed just like everyone. They have good days and bad days just like everyone. Mental health is not perfection. Mental health is the ability to function well enough to have a satisfying life. The field of psychopathology has been dominated by science for just over 100 years now. And increasingly, it's been dominated by science. Why? Well, because science is working. Science is helping us to understand these disorders, to be able to predict them, and most importantly, to be able to either prevent or treat some of the disorders. The science of psychopathology uses very specific criteria for evaluating evidence about a disorder and how it develops. There's a relatively small number of people who dominate the field of psychopathology, about 300 worldwide. Those 300 people often work with others, their own graduate students, for example, or other people that do occasional research but don't specialize in doing research in the area. But those 300 represent about 90% of the research papers that are quoted in other research papers. We call those citations. Now, those 300 people don't work in all forms of psychopathology. There are hundreds of diagnoses. They tend to specialize. They might focus mostly on mood disorders like depression, or anxiety disorders like panic disorder. And there may only be a dozen or 24 people worldwide who account for most of that research. And they generally all know one another. They meet one another at conferences on a regular basis. These are the individuals that are changing this field. Since I've taught this course for just over 40 years, going back to my graduate school days, I can tell you the field has changed dramatically. I can also tell you that some of the things we were absolutely sure were correct were wrong. But that's the nice thing about science. The process of science corrects itself by finding evidence when our ideas are wrong and forcing us to develop better ideas that fit the evidence. I mentioned earlier that the Diagnostic Manual, published by the American Psychiatric Association about every 10 to 12 years on average, is called the DSM, which is short for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Our current version, version 5, might suggest that there were 4 previous versions. In fact, there were 6. Both DSM-3 and DSM-4 had sort of half editions called DSM-3R for revised and DSM-4TR for text revision. Don't ask me why they didn't use just revised for DSM-4. I had nothing to do with that. The first 2 editions go back to the early 50s and into the 60s. And I can describe them in a single word. They were worthless. That's a pretty strong word for something that was put together by an entire group of individuals, but they were. And the reason they were worthless is that they made the diagnosis not on the basis of objectively observable symptoms, but based on what caused those symptoms, what inside of the individual was responsible for those symptoms. Now, the problem is, I can't read minds, and neither can any other psychiatrist or psychologist. So 2 well-trained psychologists or psychiatrists could look at the same patient and come to very different conclusions. In the terms that we use now, the diagnoses lacked inter-rater reliability. If 2 people can't agree on what the problem is, we can't study that problem. We can't build a science. We have to have inter-rater reliability to be able to do anything. Starting with DSM-3, we focused on objective symptoms that could be observed reliably by people who are well trained to observe them, and therefore the diagnoses became more reliable. Once we could make a diagnosis reliably, we were then able to study a disorder in detail.